Welcome to the Mason Duchatschek Show. And before we jump in, this episode is brought to you by WorkforceAlchemy.com, helping leaders uncover hidden profit leaks inside their business operations. Today's guest, Jackson Lynch, is a 4-time Chief Human Resource Officer, founder of Talent Sherpa, and a trusted advisor to CEOs and boards. He helps leaders cut through HR theater and make people strategy show up in revenue, margin, speed, and accountability rather than activity. Welcome to the show.
Mason, it's great to be here with you and all your viewers and listeners.
So you said that leaders need to stop treating talent as a side conversation and start treating it as an execution issue. Can you expound on that?
Yeah. First, I think you have to start with how do we put the function up for the CEO? So it may not always start with the CEO as the challenge. I think historically, we still fall into the functional update, and the functional update is always going to be at the end of the board slides. They are going to be the ones that are disconnected from the main conversation, right? So that's how you can actually tell the altitude a CHRO is playing. If you have the strategy oversight by the CEO and the financial lens from the CFO, and then you have all of the operational lenses to execute that strategy. And then at the end of the deck, in a few slides that may or may not get their full time, depending on how much fast the meeting has gone and how much time they need to compress, you have HR updates that are unrelated to the first narrative. So what's missing? If you go back and you look at Deming, he would argue that 94% of all of your execution problems are system problems, not people problems. And so it's not only that CEOs are missing that talent constraints are enterprise risks, but they're also misdiagnosing it as a people problem where it's usually a system problem. And it's the underlying architecture that needs to be looked at in order to connect things back in. And when it works, because you don't have a sidecar at the end of the board meeting. You have a naturally occurring, here's the strategy, here's the financial lens, here's the talent constraint lens, and then here is the operational challenges to go execute it. And the whole story flows much more fluidly, and everything connects in there.
It's funny you say that because I wrote an article recently talking about system and people. The general gist of it was that if something as simple as a hiring mistake keeps occurring, it's not one mistake. It's a process with the system that keeps producing the same people that aren't doing a good job. And what happens then as a result of that? Well, then the good people get tired of carrying the extra workload of the ones who aren't as capable or aren't as willing or don't have the work ethic. Or they realize that they don't need to contribute super high effort because less effort and less talent and less ability is acceptable. And again, what kind of problem is it? That is a systems issue because the system keeps allowing the same mistake over and over and over again. So anyway, I'm getting off a tangent on that one, but you got me all kind of fired up on that one. So
yeah, let me dive in on that one though, because
please.
it's a really important point to double click on for anyone that's listening. Your top performers are constantly auditing your culture.
Amen.
You have got to do it yourself so that you understand what it is that you're signaling to the people that you want to deliver discretionary effort. And it's surprising to me how few people actually take the time to say, what were my last 100 business decisions? Now let me look at it through a talent lens and understand, what am I signaling to people? Because I'm sure we'll talk about it later, but culture, we like to talk about culture. Culture is decision residue. It is the unknown and unnamed things that everyone pays attention to and they understand innately and they apply. So engagement scores are interesting, but that's a symptom. It's the architecture that gets people to make the decisions that deliver the residue that allows people to say, this is how you win here, and all of that is aligned. That's how you create the magic.
Agreed. So when a new chief human resource officer steps into the role, what are the first signs that they are operating too low in the organization and not yet thinking at the enterprise level?
So you have to look at the mandate. And so I work with CHROs who are either first time in role And those folks have a very narrow path to get it right. Or I deal with folks that are kind of navigating a brand new CEO. They have an even sharper cliff to their left and to their right. And what is really important in either of those situations is to understand what is the mandate. And candidly, this is where the CEO has ownership of providing the clarity of what it means. We say strategic. If you have 10 people, you're going to get 25 different versions of what that means in practice. And so you got to be very, very thoughtful about what is that mandate and what does it look like? A job that says, I want you to look at my business strategy through a talent lens, understand the talent constraints, and then figure out plans to relax those constraints so we can drive performance. That's at one altitude. A brand new CHRO that steps into the role is probably going to hear something like, well, first, we need to get the trains running on time, which is a functional level altitude. And by the way, that's important work and sometimes really hard, but it sets up a loop that's reinforcing at a low altitude functional level, which then has a CHRO identity that feels like it's just a more senior version of what my prior life was, which by the way is not what the role requires. But it helps you feel useful and functional and practical, and you get all sorts of gratitude for that. Next thing you know, it doesn't take long until you've locked yourself into an altitude that doesn't help drive enterprise outcomes. So to answer your question really specifically, where do you look? You look at what the altitude is and what that mandate says about where you should be operating. And candidly, that has got to be negotiated almost immediately upon joining if it doesn't happen before you start.
What does that negotiation look like?
I'll give you a real example. I was talking about a really interesting opportunity earlier this week. And as I was talking with a fund manager on it, he said, well, are you excited about that? And I said, I need you to look and say 24 months from now, if we're moving towards an exit over that time period, if you're sitting in the role and you've hired me and we've had a marvelous, outstanding experience together, what was it that I did to drive the business outcome? If they can't communicate that back, and by the way, the person I talked to was great, but if they can't communicate that back, you know that they haven't thought about the altitude, and that mandate is going to default to the baseline functional one. However, I've had conversations like I did with this person who was able to say, I expect us to have higher degree of talent density in the roles that matter. I expect you to be the consigliere to the senior team and help us take a bunch of very highly functional individual contributors and turn them from a bowling team into a football team where everyone's running the same play. I want you to help us have the talent philosophy in place that says, here's how we're going to operate, and here are the rules we will operate by, and here are the operating norms we're going to operate through. And then you can build all of the functional stuff underneath of that. If those three things are in place, high talent density being the most critical of them, we know that will then drive a oversized outcome, which is how we're all going to win.
So I know one of the strongest ideas in your work is that HR has to move from a cost mindset to an ROI mindset. What does that shift look like in practice? And where do you leaders usually get it wrong at first?
Yeah. Well, it's a really easy fix. Most people start with it wrong because most HR people, if I can be a little bit self-deprecating, because I think we've all been there that have been in this role. As an HR person, you walk around with a bunch of functional programs that you're looking for a known problem to solve with what you already have built. This is even harder to avoid if you are a large company number 2 moving into an SMB number 1, because that infrastructure difference is it's palpable. What do you how do you approach the world of if you think about making the move from a cost mindset to an RL mindset, what it really I think means is you move from having a functional set of programs to adapt it to you look at the business strategy through the talent lens and you say, what is getting in the way of our performance? And if it's talent related, guess what? We probably put the constraint on there. So we ought to have a pretty good idea of where to toggle that back a little bit. If it's, as it's often the case, a system architecture issue, well, then you start worrying on that piece as well. And so you then add the term that. That's your tell. if I'm doing X so that, and it is one at max 2 steps away from something you can measure on the P&L, you're still in a cost mindset. If I'm driving engagement, which seems like a noble goal, and in many cases it is, you've got to be able to say, I'm driving engagement so that I can do X.
Okay, so let's play on that one for a second, because I've got an example in my mind. I've had conversations with peers about HR topics, and we've talked about the being in a transactional role of HR and transformational role of HR. And when the functions are transactional, then that's viewed as a cost. Like, when I mean by transactional, I mean the HR director, they produce the payroll, they answer employee questions about benefits, they onboard new employees. Those are transactional things. These are part of the process and the things that you do. And there's a cost associated with that. However, the downside of that, or the risk of that, is an employer can look in that and say, well, gee, if we could use a HR system that could answer all these questions with self-help, then we might not need an HR or as many HR people on staff, because the employees can go online to this portal and get all the answers themselves. Or, hey, if we outsource payroll, we might not need another HR person on our team. We can outsource that. And all of a sudden, the employer is looking at, how can I reduce costs without sacrificing the quality of the work that needs to be accomplished? And if HR executives are allowing themselves to be in that role, costs are looking to be cut by boards now and CEOs. But if you talked about employee engagement, but if a company's doing 100 million in labor costs a year, and you've seen the Gallup surveys that say 52% of employees are sleepwalking through the day, doing enough not to get fired, and 16.5% are actively hostile, disruptive, and trying to cause problems, it's not a stretch to say, oh, employees are going to half speed, and that's enough to keep their jobs. And if you got $100 million payroll, half speed effort, you're paying $100 million for work, but you're getting $50 million worth of work accomplished. That's a $50 million a year profit leak. So if I am a strategic HR person, and you spoke in terms of employee engagement, and I know how to increase the engagement of my employees by even 10%, that's a $10 million a year savings. And if I'm an HR director worried about keeping my job, it's a lot easier to justify what they're paying me in salary if I'm generating exponentially more than what they're paying me. And now I am not a cost. That's an ROI that is exponentially greater than anything the company invests in me.
No doubt. If there is a job that doesn't have a return higher than the underlying cost, then with every other allocation decision, you should remove that cost. So it is incumbent upon all of us to do it. But let me push back on a couple notions that he had there.
Please do.
One of them is that we should focus in on creating increased engagement, and I think engagement is a symptom. So the question is, what do you need to do to get a different symptom of the underlying architecture? And so
Let me stop you there.
Yeah.
I will shift. I will pivot with you and
Okay.
give you a different example.
Okay.
Okay. I happen to be very knowledgeable about pre-employment testing, skill, attitude, personality, behavioral based validated assessments in compliance with the EEOC's 80% rule, and so on and so forth. Let's just take a very basic thing. And let's just say I have a very large hourly workforce, warehouse, manufacturing, et cetera. And what do I care about? I care about honest, reliable employees with a work ethic. If you want to reduce labor costs, hire people who have a work ethic, who show up on time and give good effort. They work hard because that's what they're taught. They grew up that way. And if I have a tool, which they exist, and my company, in full disclosure, my company provides tools, which is why I can talk about this. My company provides tools that can help you measure things like work ethic, reliability, and integrity before you hire somebody. Well, gee, if you're hiring people with a work ethic and avoiding ones that don't, it's not hard to increase. You call it engagement, call it output by 10% or 20% or 30%. I mean, you could do the same thing for employee theft. Well, gee, if you want to do some shrinkage, hire honest people. Well, you can measure integrity before you hire somebody. Those are things that an HR director can do to produce ROI, job security, raises, promotions because they are now an asset to the company, not a cost.
Yeah, I look, I totally agree with what you're saying. In fact, I was laughing inside my head while you were having the conversation. I used to work in rural Texas in the paper industry, and I had one rule when I went on campus. I would ask people what they did in high school. What job did you have in high school? And number one, I wouldn't hire someone that didn't work in high school. And the second thing I would do is if they said I worked on a farm, they skipped every other step and they went straight to, you have a job. When do you want to start? Because of the same thing, right? So I'm completely with you. It's been 20 years since I've thought through that. So like you and I can disagree maybe on the best way to create that outsized value, but here's I think the point I'd love to have a sit with for a minute. It is not activity for activity's sake. And by the way,
Amen.
when you do activity, you get this wonderful dopamine hit. It is awesome, which is why we keep doing it over and over. But I think the most impactful, highest ROI activity for an organization to increase the throughput of their workforce is to provide clarity, and clarity in terms of outcomes. And we don't do a good job of that at all. And so I think engagement is a byproduct of understanding what is winning look like. Am I getting regular feedback on my performance against that? Does somebody actually care about my development as a human being? And do I have consequences, both positive and negative, for how I'm performing relative to the feedback, relative to that clarity? And if I
That feedback's important.
and,
I
oh,
love what you're saying there.
and so, but this is why I will push back on the engagement piece a little bit, because that is a downstream symptom of the upstream architecture from my experience. And if you can figure out, like, just step back, and if I'm a CEO and I say I want to increase my organization's throughput measured with all sorts of measures so that I can deliver better revenue, less risk, better revenue retention, margin accretion, whatever it is that is important to me, market share, whatever is important to me for that business. I think the most important thing that you have to start with is, I am going to provide you clarity on what your job is expected to deliver. And if I'm an HR director and I'm looking at my business and I look at our job descriptions, which are kind of artifacts from I kind of expected to see them when Indiana Jones went in to find the Holy Grail. Like, that's how old that structure is. And second only to our performance management process in terms of things that seemed like a good idea at the time. And we need to rethink in the world beyond the agrarian calendar. And trust me, that's the first and last agriculture reference I'll make. And it's got to be around providing the clarity for people to know what is expected of them at work, both in terms of what their managers are, and then also up and downstream and whatever systems and handoffs they have. And it's that architecture, I think, has such an outsized value, which comes all the way back to the question you had. How do you move from a cost mindset to a return on investment mindset? It is all based on how you are framing the work. And I think the best way that you can gauge whether you're framing it right is you ask the question, I'm doing this so that. And if you can't come up with the answer to the so that, you are probably managing in a cost space.
I'm gonna piggyback on what you're saying. You might be getting a little bit more alignment with me. I think we're coming together here. We may be using some different words, but I'm going to ask you to ponder the answer to 3 questions. Number 1, have you ever been mismanaged?
Multiple times.
What was your productivity like during that period of time?
Really, really high, but the productivity was finding a different job.
Okay, fair enough. And did the person who was mismanaging you make any effort to fix it?
First step is to admit you have a problem. And that was not there. So no,
So,
I agree with you on all 3.
okay, so when we start talking about ROI versus cost, you said so that. So if I am a business owner or a CEO and I'm looking at chief human resource officer that's going to talk to me about, we'll just say improving employee engagement, reducing labor costs, whatever, I might say I'm willing to invest in training and coaching some of my leaders to reduce friction and to stop mismanaging people so that they quit doing enough not to get fired and don't walk around my office like no good deed goes unpunished. And if I do a great job, I'm going to get hit with more work. And what I'm trying to convey back to you is I agree with your comment so that this is the problem, i.e. too high labor cost, disengagement, but we're going to invest in training our people to do these things so that we can reduce friction and increase discretionary effort, which is an ROI.
Yes.
And HR directors that know how to have that conversation and frame things in that way are way better off than those who don't. And employers who give the latitude to the HR executives to actually execute that stuff, those people win too. That's a win-win as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, the decision rights and the autonomy to act fall nicely in there. You have to package all three of those things together, and oftentimes they don't.
So you've talked about the importance of CEOs and chief human resource officers agreeing on what good looks like. What are the most important expectations, in your opinion, that should be clarified in the first 30 days of that partnership?
Yeah, so I would any place that says strategic, you need to work together to redefine what that means in operational terms. And again, I'm a believer that clarity of outcomes is critically important. So back to the question that I asked the person I was talking to. 24 months from now, we're having a successful exit. What do you define my role in that process to be? Like, that's the nature of the question you need to get to. What does winning look like for this role? To be fair about it, we have not developed that skill in a lot of CEOs. And so it is incumbent upon us as senior HR leadership, human capital leadership, to help help them get to where that definition needs to reside in ways that you both can finish each other's sentences and answer the question. We will know that this was a successful hire when boom, boom, boom. Okay. And if one says I'm strategic and the other says I keep the trains running on time, you need to stop, because everything else downstream is going to be a fight. The second thing I think is you need to align on decision rights on what can I decide by myself? What do I need to decide with your input? What things do I recommend that you decide? And where is my autonomy to act? Because the autonomy to act, the clarity of outcomes, and the decision rights are critical in what you're actually trying to get to, which is an altitude that allows you to diagnose, look at the business strategy through a talent lens, say, here's what I think is going to happen. Here's why I think it's going to happen. Here's the root cause. And then here's what we do about it. And then, and only then, is when you reach into your bag of HR programs and you figure out which one meets the moment. That is a very strategic moment. But to be fair, most of our jobs are dirty hands jobs outside maybe the top 50 companies in the world. It is. So by talking strategic, like, that means so many different things to different people. You've gotta narrow down what that scope is and what winning looks like.
You've said that the chief human resource officer has the data while the CEO has the anxiety, and no one is building the bridge. Can you share a real example of what that bridge looks or sounds like in the boardroom or executive meeting?
Yeah. So I think we've all been in board meetings where the HR person's talking at the end and there's an engagement slide and it says engagement is down 10%. Or we say, hey, we're worried about retention risk, or we show a broad number and it's disconnected from the anxiety the CEO is really feeling, because the CEO is worried about execution. We are answering a question about vibes. That's the disconnect. If you have a CHRO that walks into that very same discussion and answers it this way. I've looked at the business strategy and I've mapped out the 12 pivotal jobs, the jobs where outsized performance will have the most outsized impact on our ability to achieve that business strategy. I have looked at that. I've then made sure we understand what the outcomes look like for each one of those roles. And as I've gone through that, I've found that half the jobs haven't clearly defined outcomes. That is going to be our next step in the talent strategy. And as I move all the way through, what I've looked at and worked with the operational leader is, for 4 of those 12 jobs, what the incumbent can do relative to the definition of outcomes is that there are those 4 gaps. We need to figure out what we do about that as we move forward. Is it something we can teach them quickly? If so, that becomes the plan. Is it a matter that they are just not going to get there? Great. Now I need to help build the talent density transition plan. So where can I reallocate the person? How do I make the change where I have the biggest benefit, the lowest risk of the change all the way through the other? One of them is talking about an esoteric vibe. And the other one is saying, for us to hit that number that is important to you, that's causing you anxiety, I've diagnosed, I've assessed, here's where the problem is, and here's where we need to do about it. That's the difference. And that's the bridge. And honestly, I think it's on us as human capital leaders, because we talk about wanting that proverbial seat at the table, which I think is a participation trophy in corporate form. We need to be a voice in the debate about how the business runs. And the only way you do that effectively and consistently is to place everything within the context of business outcomes, which is in fact what the CEO has anxiety around.
I'm gonna get your take on this situation that I found myself in several years ago. I actually got to sit in one of those meetings, and the chief human resource officer, very experienced, very knowledgeable, and has strategic ability, knew not to come to the executive meeting with vibes and feelings. Literally, we've got this tool on our website, workforcealchemy.com, that's called the Human Capital Calculator. And she literally plugged in, and they have over 1,000 employees plus, 1,200-ish, and plugged in the payroll data from that morning. So up to date as of a few hours before the meeting, went in and said, big this conversation, but I'm going to bring the focal point to one big issue. It was employee turnover. And she had the data. She said, our average hourly employee earns this. It costs 16% of their annual salary to replace each one. This is how many we lost. Here's what hourly turnover is costing us. Then she looked at professional level positions. She said, here's what their average salary is. It costs 21% of their annual salary to replace each one of them. Here's how many of them we lost. So this is what turnover is costing us here. Senior level positions, skilled positions, cost between 150 and 213% of their annual salary to replace each of them. So she said, let's shoot right down the middle, like 182 salary. How many we lost? She literally laid out the data. Just we talked earlier. The CEO had the data. Said this is what turnover is costing us, and the guy's like, it doesn't feel like that. I don't think we're doing that bad. The CEO was the one going to the vibes and the feelings, and the HR director laid out the data and said, this is exactly what it is costing us. And the CEO was like, almost head in the sand. Like, no, I'm telling you the truth. This is the data. Those numbers can't be accurate. She said they came from this morning's payroll. They're down to the penny. What would your reaction or assessment of that conversation be?
So the first thing I was waiting to hear was what's the so what? Because that sounds like we've identified a problem, but we haven't necessarily come to the solution. You may have skipped that part of the
I did.
part of the story. I'm sure you did.
So she had some plans on how to reduce turnover, but that would have required an investment from the CEO to be able to accomplish that. That would have been the gist of it.
Yeah. So the first thing I would tell you is you started from the wrong frame. You started functionally on retention, which is generally speaking something that people think HR cares about. In my experience, once you take a really smart business person and you make them think about people, they turn off the smart part of their brain and they only think about things in terms of well, I gotta be careful how I say that. I'll give you a real life example. A long time ago, I was in the paper industry. And there was this thing, it was called a Yankee dryer. And you don't need to know anything about it other than it is really, really expensive, like 10 million bucks. It is made specifically for the machine that you need to put it on. And if you need to replace it, it takes 10 to 12 months to get a new one built, installed. And so you are down production of that line. So in a world where you're fighting for working capital, what has almost every paper mill across the world done? They buy an extra Yankee dryer. They put the 10 million in working capital. They put it in a shed and they say it's worthwhile for me to take 12 months of downtime and turn it into 2 weeks of downtime in the event something happens. It's a very smart, rational decision. We have pivotal jobs without benches. The smart play using that same logical framework is I hire somebody so that I am not going 6 months without having someone in that pivotal role where, again, having someone great versus good will have the most outsized impact on the business. we make the absolute opposite decision, say we can't afford it. And here's the difference between the Yankee dryer and a dedicated backfill. You can find something for the dedicated backfill to at least pay for themselves. But what happens is mentally, we shut down the business logic when we get into people logic because we think about it too much as cost. So the most important thing, I think, if I were to be coaching your colleague, is I would not start it from a retention piece. I would start it from the business outcome piece and re-engineer it back. And I would show the constraints that not having people in role executing will have on their ability to hit the big number. That will naturally then lead to the question of what can we do to relax that constraint? And that's where you pull in. The first one you're doing, and by the way, I've done it just that way. You are trying to build math on the assumption that is not yet assumed. Okay. On the other one, you are starting from a frame of reference that is what people are in that chair waking up and going to bed at night every day thinking about. That's how you drive things forward.
So, for business owners and CEOs who want more accountability, what are the rhythms, cadences, or operating disciplines that create real clarity across leadership teams instead of endless revisiting of the same issues?
Yeah. So this will sound a little counterintuitive, but the first thing you need to do is not solve for accountability. You solve for reliability instead. And here's why. I think accountability tends to have two elements that are not that helpful. Accountability is backwards looking and it is blame oriented. You rarely think about forward looking accountability. You might think about forward looking ownership, but that's just accountability with a slightly better name. What I encourage organizations to do is focus on reliability. What is the outcome? And what has to be true for us to be able to consistently deliver that outcome? The answer to those questions tend to get into design constraints that you work on the design constraints. The accountability question is who screwed this up and how do we make sure that we punish them for having made that decision? And usually accountability, like we've all been in this room, right? Where something went wrong and someone says, who was accountable for this? And you're not solving for fixing it going forward because you've said it's a person issue or a collective people issue. When Deming would tell you 6% of the time that's true, 94% of the time it is a system architecture issue. We miss that diagnosis at all. That's why I think talking about reliability matters. I think there are three things that ultimately, though, once you're focusing on reliability, it's around commitment, clarity, it's around an early flagging norm. And how you react to the early flags are really important because if you react poorly, when someone brings you bad news, you'll never hear bad news until the last minute again, at which point it's a crisis. So you have to think about that. And they have to ask design questions rather than blame questions. So what is it? What has to be true that might not be true? And what do we do about changing that? And by the way, the use of red teams is super helpful in that endeavor if you're familiar with that.
Go ahead and expound on that because that may not be a familiar term for everybody.
Yeah, a red team was based on Cold War U.S. military planning that wanted to say, let me pretend something is going to go wrong. What is the enemy going to do so that I can have appropriate contingent plans for those? So how does it apply? It's really well used in technology, but it should be used more broadly as a change management technique. But it gets people in the room from all stages of the process design and say, what has to be true that isn't? And let's move forward 12 months. Let's assume whatever it is that we're trying to do failed. Why? And that allows people to surface the uncomfortable truth in a way that has a permission structure that allows people to still feel like they belong to the team. Because ultimately, that's what psychological safety is. It's putting the uncomfortable truth on the table, maybe even being wrong about it, but still belonging to the team. It's not about comfort. You have to be uncomfortable. And the red team allows a permission structure that allows you to get that in place, which ultimately that is a discipline that allows you to preview what might go wrong, which allows you to design for the reliability. Because if you don't have that meeting will be had, but it'll be called accountability assignment. It'll be done after the fact. and someone's who may have just made a well-intentioned mistake, or someone that was just operating within a system that could not reliably deliver the outcome that they were looking for is going to take the shoulder, and the organization doesn't actually get better as a result of that work.
So you have spoken about the three hats that HR leaders have to wear: talent maven, employee advocate, and company defender. Which of those gets overplayed most often, and what imbalance hurts the business the most?
Yeah, I'm going to answer it within the context of CHROs who struggle first time enroll. And it's because, like, of those three, the company defender is like, how do we stay out of the ditch? The employee advocacy in the Ulrich model from HR Champions in 1996, I think, is about making sure that the organization understands the impact on employees and as factoring that into the decision making. Some people have moved that into I'm going to be the shop steward for the employees, not the same thing. And then the talent maven is making sure I have the right person in the right seat at the right time. And all three of those have a normal collective tension that allows you to make better decisions. The more junior you are in your HR career, you tend to be, you grow up in that compliance lens. So you tend to be the company defender. What happens when you grow in your career and you get to the C-suite, if you are still over reliant on that compliance lens, you will necessarily be disconnected from the business decisions you ought to be a part of, because you tend to lean into, here's why we can't do it. And in the C-suite role, if you're a head of human capital, the most important thing that I think you can focus in on is not why you can't do stuff. It still has to be effective, efficient, and defensible in that order. But it is about, do I know the jobs that matter most? Do I have the best people in those roles that I can get in the market? That necessarily requires a talent maven hat to wear. So I think that's ultimately where we stumble the most, is not making that connection between, I need to move from a compliance lens to a business lens. And if I get just double click on something else that might be helpful, one of the challenges that every CHRO has encountered is, through most of our peers' growth, they've learned how to work around HR, not through HR. And I would
That's
argue,
true.
yeah, I think so. And I think it's a large due to the fact that some HR people would say it's a matter of, it's because we have to say no. I don't think that's true. You know who says no more than us? The finance people. Okay. But they say no through a business lens. We say no through a compliance lens. And even the legal folks that ought to have a compliance lens, you would imagine, tend to still approach it, or at least the really good ones that I've worked with over the years, approach it from a risk tolerance lens, which is still a business lens. So we get stuck in this compliance lens, and we think about defensibility above all else. I'm not saying that's not important. I am saying that as a business person, you learn to work around that. And that makes the CHRO job even harder. That if you then signal that I'm a compliance person, they'll keep working around you, and you won't have the ability to influence the organization's outcomes to the degree that you really should, and the business needs you to.
So you mentioned signals. That leads to my next question. When a company says it wants a stronger culture, what are a few signals that you look for first to tell whether the culture problem is actually a clarity problem, a standards problem, or a leadership courage problem?
Yeah, it's funny. I got into a LinkedIn debate with someone I respect highly on whether or not courage is the missing link. I don't think it is. Patrick seemed to think it was. It's around clarity. And so one of the things that I do as I step into, or I'm helping other people that are stepping into that role for the first time, is help them audit the last 100 decisions that they made, and then look at those decisions from a people lens. And do those match what you have nicely put in the corporate poetry that you put on the board? And if those things are aligned, great. If they're not aligned, now you have an interrogation of why. And that can take in a lot of different flavors. But the first signal is, does my decision residue match what I would intend my decision residue to produce?
For
Because
example, can you give me an example?
I say I want collaborative people, and then I promote the non-collaborative jerk. What is
That's a good example.
that has really, really good performance? except for all the dead bodies sitting to the left and right. I can say on the poster that I want collaboration. I can have it in my first 3 slides every time I get up to a town hall. But the signal to the employee population is be like the jerk. That's how you get ahead. And in that moment of discretionary effort, or do I do X or Y when no one else is looking, which ultimately is what engagement is engagement scores, depending on how you design it, is really helpful in helping you understand the degrees of psychological freedom that people feel like they have the autonomy to make those. But if you, the, the real impact of those decisions, people almost always, if they're rational, follow the signal, not the virtue that you've signaled.
Fair enough. That's a good answer. You argued that leaders often overvalue experience and undervalue learning agility. How should executives rethink hiring and succession when the environment is changing faster than past pattern recognition can keep up?
Amen on that one. And we'll set the succession stuff to the side for a minute. I'd love to talk about that a little bit, because I think that's another artifact that we need to rethink how we do that, because there's no forcing function associated with it. But if you think about, at its core, it feels defensible to hire someone for a job and say, here are the things I need them to be able to do relative to that job. And here's the experience relative to that, even assuming that we've defined the outcomes well. The defensibility part of us would say that's really helpful. Unfortunately, the impact of that is you are really good at solving for yesterday's problems and maybe even today's problems, but you're not looking forward and solving tomorrow's problems. So how do you do that? I would argue we should decrease our reliance on experience and increase our reliance on learning agility and resilience.
I love this. And here's why I say that. I was having this conversation with someone the other day, and they said, "Oh, I've got 13 years of experience in this one particular field." I go, "No, you don't. You got 1 year of experience 13 times."
Exactly.
And I can recall back when in the sales and marketing executive land, when I'm making myself sound old here, when the internets were coming out, when marketing shifted and things like where you ranked on search engines made a difference about how many leads you got and things like that. And there were a bunch of very seasoned senior level VPs of sales and marketing running around that never bothered to upgrade their skill set. And now all of a sudden, all of the stuff that they used, when I say stuff, strategies, tactics, skills, whatever, to build themselves a successful career, none of that stuff was working anymore. And they hadn't stayed current and they hadn't stayed on top of things. They just relied on underlings to handle it for them. And now all of a sudden, a lot of these folks had all this experience and these great track records, which they did achieve using systems that were outdated and weren't going to work in the future and didn't work in the future. And they would update their resume, and then they'd go to a new job. Then they would last for about 18 months maybe, and then they ran out of other people to fire or blame for the lack of results, and they would update their resume and go somewhere else, and that stuff kept repeating. So like what you're talking about is right on the money. I didn't mean to interrupt you, but I like that's a very important point that I hope those people watching and listening tuned into. That was dead on.
Yeah, and I appreciate that. And I would also tell you it's a pretty strong case for bringing diversity of experiences onto your team, because if you have folks that have a homogenous background, you will likely have homogenous reactions to future events. And it's really like the ability to apply learning. So I'm going to go way back to my paper company days again. And I was known as asking like the most wacky question until we hired them and I told them why I did it. So my first question, it was a two-parter. These are normally engineers. So I'd say, Mason, tell me why is it that you, what do you do for fun? And so they would answer it, and I'd hear this really kind of interesting story about what they do. And so there's a benefit. You get to know them a little bit as a human being. And then I'd say, how does that make you a better mechanical engineer? Something no one has probably ever thought about in their life until I met this person named Amy. And Amy was a computer scientist. And Amy said, what do I like to do? I like to compose music. I'm like, why does that make you a better computer scientist? And this is back when a computer scientist was on a, trash, trash 80. Commodore 360 or whatever. I can't even remember what they were.
Commodore 64s. And then they
64,
came
that's
out,
what it was. Oh,
then
God.
they came out with the 128, which I actually had.
Fair enough. I personally liked the snake thing that you had to move around on your dot file. And she said, you know what it allows me to do is it allows me to think how things come together in a broader systemic approach, and that things can build on each other. And you don't have to manage things sequentially. You have to manage things holistically. And that's when I compose music. I do, and I take those same skills and I apply them over to building computer code. And I'm like, holy crap, Batman, you're hired. And that ability to apply learning from one disconnected thing to the next and make the causal link, for me, was a great sign that, look, 5 years from now, I can't predict what the world's going to look like. And that was 30 years ago. I certainly can't do it 6 months from now today with the advances. But someone who has the ability to say, I've figured this part out in a disconnected part of my world, and I can apply it to something disconnected in this other part of my world, and connect those two, I think they'll figure out tomorrow's problems about as well as anybody else. That's what I
That's
think.
amazing insight. What does a strong chief human resource officer or people leader say differently in a leadership meeting that immediately signals business fluency rather than functional fluency?
So I think every HR person since Adam has had the obligation to say, I'm launching a leadership development program. Like we've all done it. Most CHROs I'd say most HR people, human capital people broadly, will say, we're launching a development program. And that's the end of it. The high altitude person says, we've restructured how we're going to deploy high performers, and we're going to put our most critical roles, and we're going to fill in with the people most able to execute against the outcomes of those roles. And we're going to then understand the skills we need to rapidly deploy into their environments to be able to execute precisely. Okay. Now I'm solving the first person is solving a broader broader general issue. It might even be the right one. The second one is actually tying it to the business outcome and working backwards from it. So I think there's a framing. I'd also say the business fluent HR people don't update on HR metrics at all. They operate at a different altitude. They talk about, I want to talk about talent density in my important roles for the new market that we're going to go attack. I'm going to talk about speed to impact, which says from the time, as we talked before, that someone leaves the job, how long does it take till I get someone that's equally good, or at least matches the quality I expect out of that role. I'm going to talk about the clarity associated with everyone's role. Can they tell me what is expected of them at work, both up through the manager and side to their system partners if they're part of a larger program. Those things are all going to be tied to a one step away, so that.
Okay.
I think that's how you do it. And then you frame things in a risk management language. You don't frame it in a vibe language. You don't frame it in a risk. And if I could, I know we're probably getting
No,
short on
we're good.
time. We talked a little bit about succession. Succession has no forcing function. Succession planning, you can actually do all the work, and you have the binders, and you have the sheets, and everyone asks questions. They nod approvingly and knowingly and lovingly. And then how many times have you seen someone that leaves 6 months later and no one ever thinks to pull out the binder? It's a brand new original artwork exercise. That's been my modal exercise, my modal solution throughout most of my career. Why is that? Because I think most of people's succession plans are a lie. And the reason they're a lie, they're well-intentioned lies, but they're still lies, because there's not a forcing function. If you have a human capital talent portfolio optimization approach, there is a forcing function, and you're asking a different question. It's not, what would I do if this person left? It is, do I have the best people in the positions that matter most? And how can I reallocate people out of those roles so I can open up a hole for those folks that they could have that outsized influence? And those are completely different solution sets. One of them makes you feel good about an HR program. One of them has a forcing function. And in a real life example, I was with a company that I was helping, so I got to be a little careful about the specifics here. But they had like 10 people on their CFO backfill list. The actual number of people they had on the CFO backfill list was 0. But by helping us to feel good about having 10 people on the or the backfill list, no one felt bad about not doing anything. But if we instead had called out, we have a crisis here, that forces action. And I think that is another way where human capital leaders can change the elevation of the work. It's by having the courage to name what everyone kind of knows, but no one says out loud.
Interesting. So if there was only one piece of advice that you could give to people who are listening today or watching, what would that advice be and why?
I think the advice that I would get is you have to start with clarity of outcomes. It makes everything else easier. If I know clarity of outcomes, I can give you better feedback. If I know clarity of outcomes, I can give you better reinforcement mechanisms. If I have clarity of outcomes, I have a better idea of whether you are set for a future role and what it takes to develop it. If I have clarity of outcomes, I know what you might need to be able to successfully thrive in your current role, and I can work against that. If I know clarity of outcomes, I can hire better. If I have clarity of outcomes, I can fire better. It makes every other thing we do in human capital work just much, much more magically.
Same note, let's say you do have clarity. What's the advice that you give leaders who need to challenge the CEO or the board without blowing things up or putting themselves at unnecessary risk?
Yeah, look, and this becomes increasingly important when the C-suite is the dysfunction that you need to talk about.
That's why I asked it.
So the first thing I would tell you is if any of your listeners want a longer discussion on that, I have a pod that dropped here, and I think in early April on that topic. But it's this. One, you have to be very cautious about not leaning in and becoming part of the dysfunction you're trying to name. And the way you avoid that is picking where and how you name it. It's got to be third party removed. It needs to be formed as an observation, not an accusation. And you need to pick your timing pretty well. And this is where the art of being a CHRO, it's important because the science doesn't make it. You might be right, but you also have to be effective. And those two
And
things,
employed there.
and continue to be employed. Yes, no doubt. So like you pick your right time. One of the things that I have done when I've sat in roles is I have always included an element of my CEO one-with-one that includes the 5-minute block watching. And what I've told my CEOs over the years is I want us to talk about stuff, but when I bring stuff up in here, it is not because I need decisions. In fact, I really don't want you to act, but I do want you to know that I'm paying attention to something that might turn into something later, so that when I bring it to you at the crisis stage, it's not the first time you've heard about it. And where you include that kind of operating norm, it allows you to surface things as observations. Hey, I've noticed this, and boy, the last 3 times we've talked about this meeting, I've seen the CFO stop paying attention to the strategy conversation, start managing email. I think one of the possibilities is your chief revenue officer and your chief financial officer are having an issue that no one knows about. I think we should be watching that. Listen for the cues, right? That's not a problem to solve. That's an observation to deliver. Now, generally speaking, when I did that, I knew those guys weren't talking, but you can't live it with, you have a problem with your CFO and your chief revenue officer. Because what happens there? You're putting the CEO in a position to decide. And sometimes their loyalty, because they're human,
Sure.
they may not always think about it that way, but they are. They have all of the same kind of blind spots that every other human on the planet has. So how you, especially if you think that their favored nation child is part of the dysfunction, and I don't mean it like super negative, like Patrick Lencioni, 5 dysfunction teams dysfunction. There's a trust issue between those two. Like how you bring that up is super important. And that's where I use watching, because I think it allows you to surface it in a way that is observational and non-confrontational. And it allows you to navigate through and stay employed.
That was excellent, excellent advice. And I'm glad that you delivered that. I hope anybody that's stuck around this long to the very end, That was the cherry on top. I appreciate your time. If people want to know more about you, the work you do, what are the best ways for them to engage and
So
learn
if you
more?
want, yeah, if you want to learn a little bit more about the way I think about these things, two places where you can have free access to it. I do a Substack that's a best-selling Substack, goes out every Friday. I think there's some pretty good stuff in there. Also do a podcast, comes out twice a week, called Talent Sherpa Podcast. You can get it wherever you see your shows. If
I'm gonna
you're
slow you down there. That went fast. I know what you said, but for those listening, Talent Sherpa Podcast.
Yes, the Talent Sherpa Podcast. And just our role in this endeavor is to help people get to where they need to go. And that's what Sherpas ultimately do. I think the other place if you are a first time CHRO, you're one that have a brand new CEO and need some help in that. I have different options available for there, including some private coaching. You can find all of that at mytalentsherpa.com.
And if I'm betting that there's some business owners and CEOs listening today that learned what the other side of that conversation needs to be so that they can collaborate and work much more closely with their talent officers as well. So I think that people listening today, if you were a business owner or a manager, then how you interact with HR and how you encourage HR to interact with you makes everybody better. So
Yeah, for my individual coaching, Mason, roughly a third of the people I work with are the CEOs. Because let's be honest, they don't know how to manage this function. It is not something that they've had to manage up to that point. That is not true for almost every other part of the business. It doesn't even matter how they grew up. They were actively involved in the finances. They, like everybody else, they had to work around our compliance lens. And so helping them kind of unlock human capital, because especially if you're in the SMB market, the Bain Capital report came out and it said, okay, all of the traditional tailwinds are gone. This is all about improving EBITDA performance as we go forward. And the single biggest, unlock for that is operational efficiency. And by the way, the single biggest unlock around that is the architecture with which you manage talent, which is for most companies the biggest P&L cost line. So we can help you manage through that as well.
thank you so much for joining us. And I hope everyone else enjoyed it and learned as much as I did. Thank you so much for your time.
Appreciate you having me. Thank you so much.